Claire was at the top of the rubble when Imala stepped into the warm glow ahead. Pausing, she watched as Imala's pace never slowed. Her ex-comrade kept right on walking. Entering the soft light, Claire peeked around the edge of the hole. Imala's feet padded through an inch of water, the sounds ricocheting throughout the tube-like cave, zigzagging its way onward. Each segment was lit by a conjured light similar to the ones that guided them this far. Where Claire was standing now was uneven, but level with the floor of the chamber behind her. Imala was stepping down a slight incline. The water was rising up to her ankles and filling the bottom section of the cave. Claire noticed the only movements from the water was from the disturbance of Imala's feet. Further down, where the tunnel turned to the left and cut off her view of the rest of it, the water was calm. Moving forward, but allowing space between her and Imala, she studied the walls. The overall humidity that met them at the entrance of the first cave had followed them all the way to this point. Or perhaps it was the other way around. At the end of this path was a hot spring. Civi confirmed that. These walls glistened with a thick layer of moisture. Thickening beads slipped down in silent flashes to join the pool below. She already knew this wasn't a part of the temple. Again, she knew too little of this country's history to know how old that structure was, but she was definitely of the opinion its location was no accident when it came to the hot spring. Like the fort at the top of the mountain range, there were no doubt other locations with a similar setup. The apparent obscurity of this one might have been nothing more than the result of the passage of time and the shifting of culture. Yet, the way that hole was created, the hot spring here had to have been discovered after the fact. Since she and Imala happened to arrive in this part of the country at night, she couldn't confirm whether or not any parts of the temple were exposed above ground. Thinking on that upper section of the chamber they just left, perhaps that was where more undiscovered rooms of the temple had met the areas Taek guided them through. The outer walls and rooftops might have been wrapped up with vegetation, discouraging people from entering. She and Imala cleared those first series of zigzags, and finally arrived at the part where the tunnel turned to the left. The depth of the water stayed at their ankles, the surface brought to life by their presence. That was another thing Claire had considered. How far away was that person when speaking to them? Had their voice truly traveled this entire tunnel from some unknown point ahead? And since it seemed she and Imala were the only ones to walk through here recently, where did Taek go? Rules or not, he still had reasons to get back at her. Feeling stupid for not looking over her shoulder this whole time, when she did so then, she came to a stop. The sections of the tunnel between her and the temple were under total darkness. Looking forward, attentive on the conjured lights showing them the way, she never noticed when those they passed fizzled out. Neither she nor Imala had tried to hide their footsteps. Taek could have camouflaged his own with their noise. The only thing that would give him away would be his glowing arm, but like he did just before the lights went out in that last chamber, he could be hiding his arm behind himself even now. Twisting around, she saw Imala making that last turn. Before she slipped behind the edge of the tunnel wall, Claire hurried after her. Imala's forward gaze didn't falter in light of Claire's loud splashing. Neither did her pace change. Claire arrived at the beginning of the turn and stopped to look ahead. The tunnel stretched on for several more yards until opening to a larger section, revealed by what she assumed were more conjured lights. Where the ones inside the tunnel were orange in color, those ahead were a dim shade of pale blue. Imala kept going, but Claire thought to look back at the sections of the tunnel they left behind. None of the other conjured lights had gone out. It was as though Taek knew what she had been thinking and chose to hang back until she traversed that last section. She figured he didn't practice necromancy, but because of his arm, she couldn't rule out him practicing some form of conjuration. Nevertheless, it was possible for someone who didn't practice the arcane arts to walk up to a conjured light and, after realizing it emitted no heat, could snuff it out by closing their hand over it. Perhaps Teek was waiting for the right opportunity to strike, or maybe he was still adhering to the rules. Closing off their route back, though, wasn't a sign of good faith. Imala neared the end of the cave. Claire splashed her way down that last stretch, meeting Imala at the exit. Before stepping out, and as soon as the sounds she was making settled, she heard the cry of rapids. The water rose up to their shins, and they felt the current pressing against them. Imala finally stopped to study this large space. Claire looked to the left. The wall stretched away from the tunnel, but eventually started curving forward. It continued to turn, heading back to the right. Along the bottom, in the middle of this curve, was a wide opening. The water was coming from there. She could see this because of the conjured lights decorating the wall at different elevations, though the highest one didn't look to even reach halfway up, leaving most of the upper area in shadows. When she lifted her gaze, she thought she could see the bottom of a large body of mist. Looking ahead, she saw a few more lights attached to the opposite wall. This underground river was several yards wide, but the bedrock sloped upward, creating a bank on that other side. She followed the bank with her eyes to the right, seeing how it rose several feet and then flattened out to another ledge. That one went on for several more feet until meeting a vertical surface. Yet, she thought she could see a hole big enough for someone to walk through. The conjured lights were placed almost as random as those on the curving wall at her left. The only reason she assumed there was a hole there was because of the depth perception. Instead of there being a shadow, she studied the pattern of the rocks. The idea wasn't all that ludicrous, seeing as they witnessed a breach in the rock hide itself in a similar fashion earlier. Besides, she was also relying on all the other hints. Looking to the right, the river moved on between two walls of rock that were starting to converge. With yet a wide gap still left between them, they, along with the river itself, ended at a void. That's where the cry of the rapids was coming from. The bottom of the resulting waterfall was somewhere below, and the sounds echoed about that darkness. Since none of the conjured lights ventured too far on that side of this cavern, she could only guess that the river kept going through some long-forgotten corridor, one probably never explored by humans. Looking across at the rocky bank again, there were even lights sitting along the bottom of the river. They didn't form a straight line from one side to the other, but the message was clear. She started forward, surprised Imala hadn't beat her to the punch. As soon as she noticed Claire moving, though, she followed behind her. The air was cooler here, and so was the water. Claire wondered if the color of the conjured lights made her think that way. The pace of the currents blurred the opacity, but she could still see the rocky surface underneath. When she neared any of the lights, even the small amount of brilliance they emitted hid the river bottom, turning the water into a milky blue. Once they reached the ledge on the other side, Imala took the lead again. Leaning forward to use her hands to aid her, she scaled the jagged step-like protrusions of the slope. Claire waited until she got to that other ledge before climbing the slope herself. Before reaching the top, she confirmed the hole in the rock face at the end of that ledge. Imala was already stepping through it. Before Claire joined her, she stopped in front of the hole and looked down at the river. Teek wasn't there, and though it was faint, she could still see at least the last of the conjured lights just inside the tunnel they came through. Maybe he was standing just out of sight, waiting for her to leave this cavern before snuffing that final one out. Stepping through the hole, she joined Imala, and they started up a long and narrow incline. There were few conjured lights available. They were attached to the low ceiling and were spread out to the point where faded stripes of shadows separated each lit section. Still, the two girls could see the top. Imala continued to be distant while Claire was thinking on the layout thus far. If she had her bearings right, every body of water they came across had been flowing from the same direction, and that was from the mountain range. The river with the weird community, the spring feeding that first cave, and the bottom section of the temple, and now the river just behind them. Just how many of these canals were there below the surface? Since they first entered the cave, she noticed how the temperature fluctuated. Those warmer areas were settled with light clouds of mist. One surrounded them now, and she surmised it was rolling down this slope from the area waiting above. The higher they climbed, the warmer it got. When they finished their ascent, the cave leveled out. There was no conjured light hanging above, but they could see the cave made a sharp turn to the left. Some type of radiance was reaching inside here from that next space. The mist also was crawling its way around the curve. Imala was already heading for the exit. Claire didn't stop, but again decided to let her ex-comrade get ahead several steps. Making that turn, Imala's expression remained blank as she stepped out into whatever waited beyond. Hearing nothing like a gasp or sudden exclamation, Claire made the turn. The ceiling shot away to hide above a blanket of mist. The walls spread out in a slow curve forward. They eventually disappeared behind the large rock formation centering this chamber. Claire and Imala were forced to stop not too far out from the mouth of the tunnel, because the base of that formation had spread to almost come in contact with the walls. Conjured lights sat along the bottom in a semicircle. As though designating another tier above them, a smaller grouping of conjured lights sat in their semicircle row. Together, there was plenty of light to expose the smooth outer surface of this formation almost all the way to its summit. Yet, while the bottom of the mist reflected the light back down, the top of this cone-shaped configuration was darkened. Claire noticed one spot in the mist that was a bit brighter than the rest. It wasn't because someone had tossed a conjured light up to float among all that thick moisture. With a grin, she knew someone had placed a light at the top of this tiny mountain. The reason why it wasn't seen was due to the fact that it was at the bottom of the hot spring up there. All the ones fixed in their semicircle arrangements were so because the tiny mountain was protruding from the back of the chamber. She noted the wet surfaces throughout. The trench-like section between the walls and the base of the tiny mountain was half full of water. As the heat changed it to vapor, the hot spring at the top would belch on occasion. Even now, she watched rivulets guiding the excess down into the trench. There was no telling how long it took this hot spring to form its own throne room. To this day, it continued to do so. Other conjured lights were attached to the surrounding walls. The cave that brought her and Imala here wasn't the only one. However, all the other holes were placed in the walls at higher elevations, some dangerously high. She was almost surprised that there weren't any stairs offering a way down, but even if there had been, they would have bypassed the trench at the bottom, ending at one of the tiers along the tiny mountain's slopes. Kind of a lost opportunity, she thought. There could have been some hierarchy established with this setup. The privileged, according to their rank, would step out from their caves, take the stairs available to them, and then stand upon the tiny mountain near the supposed throne. She and Imala, being the lowly peasants they were, had to look up from the very bottom. The natural elements involved, however, were unbiased. "Well," Claire spoke, "Sivy wasn't lying after all." She had kept her voice low, but it still carried throughout the large chamber. Sivy was well acquainted with the rings. That groggy voice boomed from above. At first, the two girls lifted their heads, trying to guess which hole the voice came from, but each entrance was darkened, showing nothing. They then dropped their gaze to the pair of semicircles. Those weren't the rings the voice was referring to, Claire thought. Surely not. This second look, however, brought something to her attention. Having missed them before, she was now aware of all the piles of clothes lying in random spots along the slopes above both rows of conjured lights. Thinking they were part of the rock formation's textured surface, she could make out some of the lighter colored ones along the bottom. She dropped her gaze to the trench less than a foot away from her toes. What could have been mistaken as sediment lining the bottom was, as no shock to her, layers of salt. She glanced over at Imala, who was now staring up at the edge of the hot spring. Steam plumed from the top of this tiny mountain, continuing to fill the upper section of the chamber. "Don't you want to know them as well?" the voice asked. Claire was startled when Imala spoke, lifting her voice. "What do you have to do?" "Your first payment," the voice replied. "It will grant you access to the first ring. All you have to do is present yourself." Her eyes fixed upon the hot spring, Imala stepped forward. Claire looked down to watch her bare foot sink below the water and press into the salt at the bottom of the trench. It was wide enough she could put one foot in front of the other, but she stretched her other leg further to place her foot at the base of the rock formation. Taking her foot from the trench, she placed it beside her other and stood upright, waiting. The voice rumbled about the chamber. "Very well. You have been accepted by the first ring, but that only confirms the payment of one." "I have more," Imala said. The voice was silent a moment before responding. "He taught you, Samson." "That's right." "Before you proceed further," the voice said, "let me ask you this. How do you feel about yourself?" Imala's brow wrinkled slightly to the question. "All those payments taken into yourself," the voice continued. "So much vileness. Do you have no guilt, or do you feel dirty?" Imala arched an eyebrow. "Dirty? Because of those people? Why should I? After all, did they feel anything when they reanimated the dead?" "Ah," the voice responded, "necromancy." "Using bodies like puppets," Imala continued, her grin spreading over her face. "Like playing out their fantasies. Sure, they used complete strangers, but that alone is devious. But what if they actually used someone they knew? Someone whose habits and interests they knew, but made their body do something that person would have never done when alive. Incredibly deviant." "So you feel no guilt," the voice said. "What if I don't?" Imala snickered. "The rings could care less whether or not you feel guilty about collecting your payments," the voice answered. "But the nature of the act can't be denied. Your awareness of that is key to all of this." Imala snorted. "I'm no stranger to death." The voice chuckled. "That's good. For one to complete the rings, they must grow accustomed to obtaining these payments. As they do, they taint themselves. That is the whole point to the ritual. To be able to go beyond, you must curse your flesh with the intent to be rid of it. When the physical body becomes so foul, you will have no choice. Stay caged within your ruin, or tear it all down." "So how do I prove I have more payments?" Imala asked. "Climb to the top," the voice said. "Climb as high as you can. Your number of payments will determine how far you can go." Imala observed the conjured lights nearest her along that first semicircle. Claire assumed she thought they were the source of judgment the voice was implying, but they weren't. They were the same as all of those they passed on the way here. Taking her first few steps, Imala moved between them. When she arrived at the second set, she watched those next to her as she passed between them. It was when she was above them and walking among the discarded clothes that Claire heard a voice just behind her. She didn't whip about in a defensive manner because she knew who was there. He had been there for some time now. "So she wasn't lying after all," Teik grumbled. Claire didn't respond. Imala seemed oblivious of him, her eyes still focused above. Even while she stepped upon the pieces of clothes in her path, her attention was steadfast. Leaving the combined brilliance of the conjured lights, she seeped into the shadows, only to be silhouetted against the glowing hot spring above. There were moments when she had to bend down and grab at the slope to pull herself up. The surface was always covered in moisture, but her feet never slipped. The voice chuckled. My, you and Samson both are so eager." Claire had a notion to speak up, to warn Imala about going any further. Even if achieving beyond as Samson had, there was a reason these people were upset at his absence. She thought to glance back at Teak and see if there was anything to read in his expression, but turning her head would give her away. Being able to stand here like this, listening to a voice from someone they didn't know, the only way out of here that was available to them being blocked, the present silence felt full of expectation from all parties. Imala was at center stage. Maybe it was because of the silence that everyone was privy to her heavy breathing. The air was thick and oppressive, but Claire was sure Imala didn't start off her climb sounding fatigued. As high as she was so far, and as steep as the slope got closer to the top, Imala had no choice but to keep using her hands to help her scale the surface. As Claire looked on, she knew that the less of Imala's silhouetted form she was seeing, the drawing in of air extending more after each breath, and the slower her progress became, that something else other than this chamber's temperature was to blame. Yet neither the voice nor Teak said a word. Imala's breathing boomed against the walls. With so much of the chamber under shadow, and with the air always wafting about, Claire thought her head was vibrating from the sound. She had to wonder if she herself was breathing, being so caught up in the rhythm. The vibration even played with her vision, making her think all of the conjured lights were growing dim with each exhale, and then brightening as Imala breathed in. Like a pulse, they moved the shadows along the walls, trying to trick Claire into believing the rocky surfaces were expanding and shrinking inward. She gritted her teeth, trying to put the sound out of her head, finding it frustrating that she had to actually focus on her own breathing, even though she wasn't fatigued. Clenching her fists, she was about to shout into that chamber, anything to break that rhythm. Perhaps she would simply yell at Imala to stop. Imala grunted and dropped to her knees. She hung her head, and for a moment she appeared as nothing more than a lump upon the slope of the tiny mountain. Her breathing had changed. Instead of the prolonged sweeping of the air to and fro, Claire was able to sigh now that whatever grip that had her was released. The conjured lights burned at their constant, and the shadows along the walls no longer crawled and slinked backward. Imala was still breathing heavy, but the sound didn't venture far beyond her. "Heh," Teak chuckled to himself. "Well now," the voice filled the chamber again. "As eager as you are, it appears you have not collected enough payments to reach the top." Claire considered the number of clothes lying along the slopes, the amount of salt in the trench. How many pieces of garments was she not seeing? How much salt had settled upon the surface of the tiny mountain? How many people made up the community that were taking part in these rituals? Teak was empty-handed now, which meant the body he brought for Civi was more than likely still lying out in that pool before the cave entrance. She doubted Imala wanted to make that trip all the way out there just to gain more distance up the slope. "But Imala heaved. "There were so many." "Ah," the voice said, "but to be able to go beyond, you must get to the point where you despise your own flesh." Imala said nothing, still hunching over and struggling for breath. "It seems Samson only taught you so much," the voice eventually said. Catching her breath, Imala responded, "Wait." She lifted her head slightly. "You said the body must be cursed. Is taking in the payments the only way to do that?" "Oh," the voice mused, and Tayak chuckled to himself. You have something else? Slowly taking in a breath and then exhaling it, Imala responded, What about an act of disgrace? Below, Claire furrowed her brow at the question. What do you mean? The voice asked. Imala expelled another breath, took one in, and then pushed herself upright. Rocking back on her haunches, she slapped at the buckle in the middle of her tunic. It popped loose, followed by all the smaller ones throughout. The garment loosened from her shoulders. She shrugged out of it and flung it to the side. It was lost somewhere in the shadows along the slope. Imala then unbuttoned the front of her trousers. She slipped them off her waist and down to her knees. In order to remove them from her shins, she twisted around to sit upon the slope and, huffing and heaving, she pushed her trousers from her feet and let the garment drop out of sight. Turning back around, she got on her knees again and presented herself to the hot spring above. Claire knew what she was going for, despite the result being nothing more than her silhouetted body in the limited light offered at the top of the tiny mountain. A noble attempt, the voice said, but you must offer something more severe. Payment in blood. I didn't come all this way just to stop right before the end, Imala scoffed. Indeed, the voice said, unlike the rest of us who live nearby, you are from outside this country. But don't worry, there is a solution. Join us in our endeavors. Join you? Imala questioned. Yes, the voice said. Here in the shadows, or out there with the sentiments of the community. Turning her head to either side, she asked, What do you mean? What endeavors? Ah, the voice sighed with pleasure. We here on the outskirts of society, we the forgotten, we are just like the war. The war? Imala asked. Yes, the voice responded. For the rest of this country, it has long since been over. Yet, for some of those on the other side of the mountains, they can't let things stand as they are. We of this community make sure their efforts go unnoticed. Claire gasped under her breath, focusing again on all of the pieces of clothing lying against the rock formation. Then she looked down at the trench filled with salt. You kill them, she breathed. Convenient, eh? Tayak said. She looked back to see him standing with his arms crossed, a smug look on his face. She couldn't help but study this occurrence. Even though his left arm was ethereal, his natural arm reacted as though his ghostly arm was made of flesh. Interesting. Turning back around, she looked up and waited to see how Imala would respond. Since Samson had seemingly used this community to learn how to make himself beyond, then Imala also knew that he had no desire to be with these people. You mean, Imala huffed, I'd have to wait around here? It is a process, the voice said, one we're all going through. Imala scoffed. Just how many do you have to have? How many kills? There was a pause, and then the voice asked, Are you asking for the completion of the first ring, or all of them? The first? Imala questioned, and turned her head to look back down the slope. What do you... Oh, the voice responded. I see. You misunderstand. Once you reach the hot spring at the top, you have not completed the ritual. No, you have only completed the first ring. What? Imala breathed, whipping her head back around to gaze up at the top. Once at the top, the voice continued, you can choose right then to give up a portion of your body, but you will not be able to give it up entirely until all rings have been completed. All rings, Imala whispered. Now, the voice continued, you can also choose to keep your body intact until you've completed all rings. But know this, the more payment you take in, the more your body is cursed. It's why we live out here on the edge of the country. between normalcy and revenge. The only ones who could continue this would be monsters. To the rest of the country, we appear as such more and more. To those who seek revenge, we're demons that thwart them. You're saying, Claire began, that you look more grotesque the more rings you complete. It was an obvious conclusion, but she wanted to say it out loud so that Imala would really take it in. A curse is a curse, the voice said. What is the point of your body anyway, but a testament for how much you have earned the right to go beyond? Imala had no response. To Claire, her silence signaled either a hesitation or a defiance. She at least hoped for the latter. But look at how close you are, the voice continued. If you stretch your arm forward, it would be a single step and you'd complete the first ring. All you would have to be able to do is touch the edge of the hot spring. Imala dropped down on all fours, immediately having to suck in a long pull of air. When she let it out, she lifted her right hand and extended it ahead. Behind Claire, Teak chuckled out loud. The voice, at the moment, was silent as Imala leaned forward, splaying her fingers. It was so strange to Claire, as she watched, how a simple action could be so taxing on her. But it was true what Teak had said. The so-called rings can't be lied to. Imala was squeezing her eyes shut, not only straining against her failing strength, but keeping the sweat from pouring into her eyes. She wanted to move forward. It wasn't even that far to go. It had only taken her but several seconds to get to this point. What was one more silly step? You know, the voice spoke up. Being so close, I would wager it would take but one more payment to complete the first ring. Imala gasped, her arm falling as she dropped against the rocky slope. There, she panted, concentrating only on her breathing. Tonight would have been Civi's night to complete the second ring, the voice said. Like you, she lacked but one payment. Teak, her second, had brought the kill for her. Since you took blood from Civi, the ring might let you take payment from her last kill. Could this be our chance? Claire wondered. Were we actually being allowed to go back outside the cave? It can't be that easy, not with Samson's betrayal still lingering. What do you say? The voice asked. Would you test the ring's judgment and take from someone you have replaced? Heh, Teak responded. Is that really possible? None of us have ever tried that before. None of us have ever been slain either, the voice said. Teak's smirk shrank before he uttered, True. Since you've come all this way, the voice continued, eager and willing to participate in the ritual to go beyond, why not settle yourself to this? Start your new life here with us. Work your way through the rings. It won't happen, Claire thought. Imala had come here looking for Samson, just like her. Yet, there was little chance in Samson returning to this place. Or, the voice chimed in again, if you are truly in a hurry to finish the first ring, the hot spring being right in front of your face, there is no rule against the slaying of your second. Claire tensed, her thoughts dissolving to bring her to the present. You would have to form another pact with one of us, the voice continued, but I'm sure you would have no trouble finding someone willing to become your second. Claire opened her fingers underneath her robes to call forth a blade for each hand, when the air around her shifted. Darkness rushed in from her right as a streak of light flashed from her left. Both converged upon her before she could move. She felt something pressing against her from behind, just as those two forces clamped down. She was lifted off her feet, her arms pinned at her sides. Teak grunted just above her head. His muscles were like stone against her tiny frame. With his ethereal arm making contact, she was aware of the contrast in temperature. Where his flesh was warm, she actually felt, not a chill, but a lack of heat off his ghostly limb. This was it. This was the moment he had been waiting for. Being a member of this community, he knew full well how all of this would have played out for the most part. This was his revenge. "Tell you what," he laughed, flexing his muscles further, "I'll even let you choose how she goes, by my hand or by your own." He was talking to Imala, Claire thought, just before her cloak's length shrank inward, slipped from between her back and his chest, and bundled up behind her neck before launching straight upward. It moved just as fast as Taek had before, leaving Claire and swallowing his head whole. His chuckling silenced, he pulled his arms away to reach up for the robe. Claire landed on her feet, stumbled toward the ground, but shot to the left. Once she distanced herself, she spun back around, planting a foot on either edge of the trench. Throwing her hands out to the sides, the blades solidified in her grips. She pointed them toward Taek, who was twisting about, trying to pull the robe from his head. "Imala," she called toward the top of the tiny mountain. "We need to leave, now. Samson isn't here." Taek froze, his body pointed in her direction. He kept his fingers dug into the cloth as he started to control his breathing. The material wasn't so thick that it would suffocate him. "But he'll be back," the voice said, his tone as calm as before. "He's already participated in the rituals. He can't leave the rings unfinished. His body won't let him." Imala popped up from the side of the slope. What do you mean? He was already beyond." "Yes," the voice responded. "But for how long, I wonder?" Imala stared wide-eyed at the hot spring. "But," Claire countered, "his whole body was beyond." She looked up at Imala. "Wasn't it?" "Like his woman," the voice said. "He too was very eager. Even though he labored among us and took in enough payments to complete the first ring, he thought he could cheat by giving up his whole body in the beginning." "If he didn't succeed," Claire shot back, "then how was he—" "A temporary tactic," the voice said, "through his knowledge in the arcane arts of summoning." Looking between Taek and Imala, Claire questioned, "What?" "There are members of our community who have dabbled in arcane summoning," the voice said. "They are not as skilled as Samson, but they might have recognized what had taken place when he fled from here." "But," Imala began, her eyes still wide, "I saw him. I touched him, and he spoke." "If you were able to touch him," the voice said, "then he was not beyond. The true meaning of being beyond is just that, out of reach." "So," Claire muttered to herself, sorting through her knowledge of the arts. Since she and Samson had gone different ways in the same arcane knowledge, it stood to reason he was capable of things she wasn't. "But he told me," Imala cried. "He said he was beyond, and he was teaching me how to do it too." "There's no denying he spoke to you," the voice said, "but that was only because he hadn't gone beyond yet. From what this community has gathered, he was merely a projection."